Have you ever felt like everyone else is moving ahead while you're somehow stuck in place? Today, success timelines are everywhere. Engagement posts, promotions, home purchases, travel milestones. Psychologists call this social comparison theory. Humans naturally evaluate themselves by observing others. Previous generations followed clearer life timelines, stable careers earlier, affordable housing sooner, predictable milestones. When timelines shift but expectations remain, identity insecurity can grow. But here's the surprising part. Feeling behind often has less to do with your actual progress and more to do with Your brain doesn't track everyone equally. It highlights people who seem ahead while ignoring those moving at a similar pace. Digital platforms intensify this effect. People usually share highlights, not uncertainty. Promotions. There's also a structural shift happening. Housing costs, job markets, and economic stability have changed dramatically.
When external realities shift.
But here's a healthier perspective. Progress isn't linear for most people. Careers pivot, relationships evolve.
Once you see progress differently, comparison loses some power. You stop racing invisible competitors.
That moment of relief often feels subtle at first. Nothing dramatic changes externally. When comparison pressure fades, attention shifts inward. You start noticing what actually matters to you.
Psychologists often call this values clarification. When external comparison quiets, intrinsic motivation.
Interestingly, perception of time shifts too. Without constant comparison, progress feels less rushed, and patience becomes psychologically easier.
Another realization often follows.
And when uncertainty becomes normalized, comparison loses emotional charge. Progress becomes personal again. Confidence rarely arrives as a dramatic breakthrough. More often, it grows quietly through repeated moments of self. When comparison fades, future anxiety often softens too. You're no longer chasing someone else's timeline.
Real life rarely follows a single timeline. People start businesses later, change careers midlife.
The key shift is ownership. When you define progress personally, external comparisons lose authority. Your timeline. Interestingly, once self-defined progress strengthens, comparison triggers become weaker.
And maybe that's the deeper truth. Feeling behind often isn't about timing. It's about perception, expectation.
When perception, expectation, and identity finally align, something subtle happens. Another realization often follows. Society promotes simplified success stories. Understanding this restores agency. You realize your path isn't late, it's simply yours, and that distinction can dramatically reduce chronic stress. There's even a physiological shift. Reduced comparison lowers stress hormones over time. Breathing slows, and perspective widens. Instead of racing others, you start appreciating personal growth. So maybe the question isn't whether you're behind, maybe it's whether the comparison was ever accurate to begin with. Once comparison loses credibility, mental energy shifts. Instead of monitoring others constantly, psychologically, internally defined goals tend to sustain motivation longer. They're less fragile, and with clearer goals, emotional regulation improves. Stress still exists, but it feels proportional instead of overwhelming.
Over time, perspective widens. Careers, relationships, and finances all fluctuate.
Identity stabilizes when comparison fades. Self-worth becomes less dependent on milestones, and confidence becomes quieter but more durable.
And eventually, the question changes. Instead of asking, am I behind? You start asking, am I growing?
When growth becomes the focus, comparison naturally fades into the background. You still notice others. Another psychological shift often follows. Self-compassion replaces harsh self-criticism. And when you look closely, you realize most people aren't as far ahead as they seem.
That normalization reduces existential pressure. Life stops feeling like a race. It becomes a process. Eventually, identity integrates around growth rather than milestones. You stop chasing validation.
And maybe that's the real takeaway. Feeling behind often isn't about reality. It's about perception. Morning clarity often brings perspective. Problems rarely disappear overnight, but they start feeling alternates. Psychologists often describe this as cognitive reframing. The external world stays the same. Acceptance doesn't mean complacency. It means acknowledging sound. Once comparison fades, future planning becomes clearer. Goals feel self-directed again. And
Eventually, success becomes personally defined, not dictated by timelines, not dictated by others.
And maybe that's the deeper psychological truth. Feeling behind often reflects perception, not reality. Emotional freedom rarely arrives suddenly. It settles gradually as perception shifts. Without constant comparison, attention returns to the present. Small sensory experiences regain.
And here's something reassuring. Feeling behind is extremely common, especially in rapidly changing economies.
Economic realities have shifted significantly over decades. Housing, careers, stability timelines all changed.
Once context is clear, personal timelines feel less threatening. Progress becomes individualized. So maybe the question changes. Not, am I behind, but am I growing in ways meaningful to me?
When growth becomes personally meaningful, motivation stabilizes. You stop chasing arbitrary deadlines.
Interestingly, comparison triggers don't disappear entirely, but their emotional intensity drops. Long-term perspective changes everything. When you zoom out, short delays lose significance.
Many pressures are socially constructed. Cultural timelines, economic expectations.
Agency returns once external pressures lose dominance, decisions feel self-directed, and psychological ownership strengthens long-term well-being. So maybe being behind isn't the right frame. Growth, adaptation, and self. When internal alignment strengthens, external validation becomes less urgent. Goals still matter. Self-defined success tends to be more sustainable. It adapts to life changes, and it protects psychological. Comparison may still appear occasionally, but now it registers as information, not judgment, and that distinction changes emotional impact significantly. Identity stabilizes when self-worth stops depending on milestones alone. That stability reduces chronic anxiety. At this point, progress feels less pressured. You still grow, but urgency fades.
And maybe the most important realization is this. Feeling behind often reflects perception, not reality.
Clarity often brings a quieter kind of confidence. Not loud achievement, not dramatic milestones.
When comparison stops dominating attention, emotional space opens.
So if you've been feeling behind lately, consider this possibility. Progress isn't always visible. Timelines aren't universal.